Hello and welcome to the program. It is the 50th day of the year, and as of Friday, there had been 71 mass shootings in the United States. On Wednesday afternoon, a gunman opened fire at a mall in El Paso, Texas, killing one person and injuring three others. And then this past Monday, Michigan State University became the latest school to have a mass shooting, with a gunman killing three students, injuring five others before turning the gun on himself. I hate to say it, but you and I both know that this will not be the last time we hear of mass shootings in this country, but no one seems to know how to stop it. Why is this such an American problem? Lawmakers keep arguing, but no one comes up with any solutions that everyone can agree on. Is it more guns? Is it stricter gun laws? Resources for mental health? It's all talk and nothing happens. And so every week we hear about new mass shootings and we see more families grieving the loss of a loved one. Trust me, I don't know the answer. But today, I'm going to talk to Dr. Alex Del Carmen, who heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Dr. Del Carmen is teaching future law enforcement officers, and you better believe that the subject of mass shootings is covered. Dr. Del Carmen joins me on the phone to talk about how law enforcement tackles these types of situations. Dr. Del Carmen, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Here we are once again, Dr. Del Carmen, dealing with a mass shooting here in the U.S. What do you hear from law enforcement officials about the prevalence of mass shootings in this country?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, right? Some people think that, mass shootings have really spiked up in the past few years. Other people think that it's a matter of the media covering them at a, greater frequency. And now with technology, being able to communicate a lot faster between, two entities. But through our lenses, I had an institute at Tarleton, which is the Institute for Predictive Analytics in Criminal Justice. And we actually looked at data that, from 1966 all the way to 2021. And we analyzed all of the, mass shootings and including the school shootings that had taken place throughout that time. And we got the data from the Violence Project, which is the Violence Project is a national entity that sort of accumulates this information. And what we found were really, really interesting things, right? So one of them is that we are, in fact, increasing the number of mass shootings across the U.S. and across the globe. But what is helping that visibility is the means of communication today. And of course, not only the frequency of it is concerning, but also the extent to which damage is done, right? So when we actually look at the carnage that's left behind, the assault weapons that are used in a lot of these, what we found is that, before, 40, 50 years ago, they were bad and they were horrible, but not to the extent that they are now, where you seem to have, not only one, but multiple victims and very little chance of survival for many of them. So like, for instance, if we looked at the insider relationship between the shooter and the location. And what we found is that for the most part, most of the mass shooters do not have a relationship to the location where they are. And the notable exceptions to that are schools and university shootings or workplace shootings, where in fact the shooter had a relationship, with the entity. We also looked at the fact that most of them were male, about 98% of them. And they were typically younger than 30 years of age. Most of them were white, although that is changing slowly with the demographical changes in our country. We also found that mental illness was a factor. Almost 70% of them were considered to be mentally ill at the time of the offense. And so I can go on, but the point here is that there is a typology, and sadly, what is mostly correlated with these is the frequency in which they happen. Once one of them happens, within a matter of a couple of weeks, we have one or two others that follow.
Dr. Del Carmen, you're in constant communication with law enforcement officials across the country. What do you think they would like to see lawmakers at the federal and the state level and the local level do about situations involving mass shootings?
It's a great question, and I will tell you that, across the United States, I teach at the FBI National Academy as an instructor. I do a lot of training across the U.S. and have been doing that for 25 years now. And one of the things that I've learned is that there is no right answer. But what we do know, however, is that more of these are going to take place. And so what I think law enforcement and we criminologists are hoping for is that legislators across the U.S. begin to have a serious conversation, not about a Band-Aid approach to being able to address mass shootings, but rather, what do we need to do in our lives every day in order to prevent them, to make that target very difficult to access by the bad guy, right? And I think that we can learn from places like Israel and other parts of the world where they live with these constant threats. And what they've done is they've put, metal detectors in their schools. They increase the number of individuals that are going to be guarding the school at one time. Response rates and response times are great. Having the right equipment for law enforcement is important. Having the right training for law enforcement is important. But it takes a while for cops to show up to the scene if they're not there already. And boy, wouldn't it be great if we are able to prevent people from coming in to our schools that are going to harm kids. And so to do that, we have to sort of think of it as a fort. We have to think of it as a way to protect the inside of that fort and make it so difficult for bad guys to be able to penetrate it. So we actually call that in the literature target hardening, make the target much, much harder to penetrate.
And it's not just schools, it's places of worship, it's malls, it's apartment complexes. I mean, are we safe anywhere?
Well, the answer to that from a criminologist with 25 years of experience is no, right?
Yeah.
But I will tell you that I often say it depends on the lifestyle that we live, and much of it is about the space where we are and the time in which we are there. Look, it's not rocket science to us to know that if you walk into a bar on a Friday night, you're probably going to be 3 times more likely to be stabbed than if you're at home. But at the same time, home can also be dangerous, right? So there is no place to be safe. But I will tell you that this conversation is one that is absolutely crucial to have, not only post a mass shooting, but really to have on an ongoing basis, which is, as a country, what sort of freedoms are we willing to give up, as you noted, at a church or at a school or at a concert? And giving up those freedoms, to some degree will guarantee or at least provide some sort of a survivable equation that we're not going to be attacked by a mass shooter or that we're going to survive it. And so that's a really difficult conversation because some people don't feel comfortable going into a school with a metal detector, but yet other people, and I know I would if my kids were little again, I would say, you know what, put all the metal detectors you want, inconvenience my kids as much as you want, but I want them to come home, after school ends, right? So that's where the balance needs to be.
And I think we're getting more used to it. I mean, you go to any sporting event here in North Texas or to a concert, you're going through metal detectors and they're checking your purse and checking your pockets and making sure that you're not bringing in anything that you're not supposed to. So I think as a country, we are getting more used to these kind of protective measures.
Right. And I think that, and I don't know how efficient those measures are right now, to be honest. I mean, I know that, going to a concert, that you do have some metal detection that's there, but I mean, do they really control the access to and from that facility prior to the event taking place? Yes. I mean, there are 1,000 ways in which someone with ill intentions can actually penetrate that area. And I know we're never going to be 100% safe in spite of all of those measures that I discussed earlier. But what we do know, though, is we have to really get serious about this, right? Look, every time we turn on the television set, it almost seems like, or we turn on the radio, we see another place. Just recently, we had another incident in El Paso. Yeah. We've had all of these issues that have taken place and come about that are really concerning, and they're going to continue. I mean, look, we're going to go shopping one day. We're going to go to a movie one day, and it's going to be us, right? Because the one thing that many victims have in common is they never thought it was going to happen to them, right? So, and so when it happens to a person, when it happens to a family member, this becomes personal. And then at that point, we begin to have those conversations, throughout. So I really do believe that it's time. It really is time for us to put politics aside. The gun control question that always comes up in these events, put that aside and have a conversation about how it is that we can make society safer, as safe as we can humanly make it, so that our kids, the most vulnerable population, our elder, another vulnerable population, and those of us that are trying to do good for society are given assurances that they're going to be as safe as possible.
My guest once again today on the phone, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, who heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Dr. Del Carmen is teaching future law enforcement officers, and you better believe that the subject of mass shootings is covered. And with at least 2 more mass shootings taking place this past week, I invited Dr. Del Carmen to join me on the phone to talk about how law enforcement is dealing with mass shooters and how the next generation of officers are being trained to deal with them. So how do you teach, Dr. Del Carmen, those studying criminology and criminal justice, when you come around to the subject of mass shootings and the mind of a mass shooter? How do you teach that? What are the students asking, and what are you telling them?
Well, most of us that are in my discipline are interested in knowing, how we can prevent this from happening. And once that they do take place, how can we quickly address them and neutralize the threat, right? And I think that we share that with the law enforcement community and with people in general, that we just want these things to be prevented altogether. The bad thing about prevention, and one of the things we discuss in the classroom, is that prevention is the most difficult thing to measure from an academic perspective, because you will never know how many crimes, how many mass shootings were prevented as a result of the presence of somebody that's armed, or the presence of a metal detector. You'll never know that. We'll never read about it. We'll never see that in the news. And so it's very difficult to sell the whole success of successful stories of prevention, because you can't tell them. Having said that, I will tell you that one of the things that we often talk about is the usage of artificial intelligence, and how artificial intelligence in some countries, for instance, the United Arab Emirates is one of them that uses it quite vastly for most security-related purposes. It's going to be, it's sort of scary on the one hand that, someone's going to have all your data, but on the other hand, it's also going to be very useful for, say, law enforcement that is interested in identifying what people are posting on social media. We have learned, for instance, in the typology that we came up with at IPAC at Tarleton, we have learned that, most of these mass shooters have a presence online that, where they almost announce what they're going to do prior to the event taking place. Now, arguably you can say, well, so do a lot of other people that never end up being mass shooters, right? So the difficulty for law enforcement is the amount of information that's on social media, and how do they understand which person is serious and which person is not. So through, various algorithms and various other components, artificial intelligence, I anticipate 5-10 years from now, perhaps, earlier than that, is going to give us the tools that we need in order to say, okay, so this person in Oakland, California is making threats, to a school and saying that in the next 30 minutes, this is going to happen. This is their geolocation. Make sure you keep an eye out for the schools in the area. That type of advanced knowledge in real time is going to be essential. And I think a lot of our students and law enforcement professionals at large are beginning to understand how technology is going to have to make a difference in how we're able to prevent these from happening, and in some cases, how we're going to be able to respond to them.
And as you mentioned, what kind of freedoms are we willing to give up? Because if they're looking at all of our searches on Google and then saying, okay, this person has been searching some suspicious items online, should we be watching them?
Right. And, we often joke around that, a criminologist database on Google must really spike up the FBI and every other federal entity, because imagine what my Google searches are, right?
Yeah.
On an ongoing basis, right, where the research that I do is related to things that are pretty horrible in our society, with the attempt of having, helping out law enforcement and helping out the community at large. But, having said that, and to your point, every society in the history of the world, we know, that has given up their rights, they end up regretting them. So I think there has to be a balance, right? And that's one of the beauties of being in this great nation that we are, although not perfect, but it is by far the best nation in the world, arguably. And I think that when you look at it from our perspective, we have the Constitution, where the founding fathers began this beautiful, piece of history with the words, "We the people," right? And we the people, not you the government, but we the people, seem to be in their minds and their hearts when they crafted the document, which actually shows that, our rights were very much important to them as they wrote it. Now, this was over 200 years ago, and at a time when we didn't have these levels of threat in our communities, there were different threats, but not the levels that we have now and the type of threats that we have now. But I do think we can, and I'm an optimist when it comes to this. I do believe we can preserve the ideals of the Constitution. We can preserve, what the Constitution was, established, while at the same time protecting society and allowing people to feel safe when they go worship God on Sundays, allowing people to feel safe when they go to a mall, and not having to worry that when you say goodbye to your teenage kid that goes to the local mall a few miles away from your home, you're going to be sitting back and really just worried sick that kid may not come back. So we the American people deserve that, and I think we all do in one way or another. So we got to get serious about this.
Dr. Del Carmen, I want to switch gears here, and I want to talk about the Tyree Nichols case out of Memphis, Tennessee, where police officers beat up Tyree following a traffic stop, and the beating was so brutal that he later died of his injuries. The video of that beating shows Tyree trying to follow the commands given to him by the officers, but they were giving him so many different commands, it was impossible for anyone to really keep up. How do you use such videos to train the people that you are teaching at Tarleton?
Well, I tell you, I first of all, it was a horrible thing, right? I mean, anybody that has a heart, you don't have to be a criminologist or a policing expert to look at that video and just feel for that family and for that young man. This shouldn't have happened to any human being, much less an American in the 21st century in today's law enforcement community. And I will say to you that I've had the privilege, it really has been a privilege, as a first-generation immigrant to the United States when I was young, and now as a trained criminologist, I've trained over 15,000 police officers throughout the United States, and in the past 25 years, and I've trained every chief of police. So my perspective comes in, chief of police in Texas, that is, my perspective comes in from the standpoint of someone that's actually been out there, not just only writing the books. And I will tell you that most law enforcement officers are honest, decent, hardworking people. They truly are. And they're people that get up every day to try to make a difference in the world. And I really believe that. I've seen it. But I've also seen that there is a group of individuals that should have never been cops. And I met them. I mean, I've had them in training classes. I've heard their hateful speech. I have seen them. And I will tell you that it's sad, because here is a very noble profession. Here's a profession that is, inhabited by people that are amazing human beings, that are willing to put their lives on the line to save you and me. But at the same time, it's being corrupted. It's being, in so many ways, mischaracterized by these handful of people that should have never been caught. So my point in telling you all that is this. We really need to do a better job at making sure we filter these individuals out from ever even considering being police officers. And if they are considering being police officers, to weed them out in the process. And I think this is really, people, seldom talk about this, because they talk about the culture of the entity. All are great topics, right? But I think what really matters here is the fact that very few people don't focus on who we are recruiting to be police officers and who are we allowing to go into law enforcement. Those 5 officers in Tennessee, they should have never been cops. Yeah. These individuals are not trainable. They're just simply not trainable. These people are individuals that felt very comfortable doing what they did to Mr. Nichols, and not only that, taking pictures of him while he was on the ground to send it to other people. That's almost like bragging about the very instance that was a criminal offense and violated just about every policy that there is in law enforcement. So I really do believe that training has to be improved, no question. I believe that accountability based on that training is definitely essential. We saw that in Uvalde as well, where you had over 400 police officers, most of whom were trained on active shooting scenarios, and no one went inside that room to save the kids. And so the fact that they're trained, that they have a certification, is not good enough. We have to make sure that police officers, when they're confronted with the threat that we train them to face, that they will act via what we call a muscle memory and act according to that training. So to that end, I think that in this particular case, they just basically they should have weeded these guys out a long time ago. They should have never worn a badge or carried a gun. And unfortunately now, I'm afraid what's going to happen is once the DOJ concludes their investigation or their inquiry into the police department, and once the other entities that are looking into the PD now begin to assess not only what happened to Mr. Nichols, but also all the other peripheral things that are there, we're going to find out that there are a lot of other characters, like these 5 individuals in that police department, that have gotten away with a lot for the past years and have never been held accountable.
My guest once again on the phone, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, who heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. And we're talking about the issues facing law enforcement officers, from mass shootings to police brutality to crime rates. Now, let's talk about the crime rates. And a lot of police departments are dealing with recruitment issues. Many officers have opted to leave their jobs because of the environment that we are in and what they face. What are you hearing about the need for new police officers here in North Texas?
You know, police departments, not only in North Texas, but throughout our entire state and also in other parts of the U.S., are just desperate to hire people. You know, police academies right now across the U.S. are about 1/3 filled. And what's happening now is many police departments are competing against each other on who's going to pay more, you know, and they're kind of almost outbidding themselves. You have here in the Metroplex, several entities that have begun to give, a bonus, package once the individual signs to the police academy, or they're promising officers that they're going to be paid X number of more dollars than, say, the city or the county next door. And so, young people that are 21, 22 years old that have a clear background and the physical and mental aptitude to be police officers are applying, but they're finding out that they're being sought by many entities all at the same time. So this is the end result, in my view, of what not only the pandemic, right, 2 very difficult years for the world and particularly for law enforcement, but also this sort of defunding the police nonsense that many people began to profess and adhere to several years ago. It is nonsense. And I said it then and I'll say it again because what society has survived without the rule of law, right? And so we need law enforcement. We just need good law enforcement officers. And no question, we need to hold them accountable. But at the same time, I made the analogy back then in '09, and I'll make it again. To not fund the police is sort of saying, on the one hand, that your child needs help at school because he or she cannot do well in math. And then at the same time, as a parent, you're going to take away the private tutoring that you would have otherwise given that child to help them out. And so, it just makes no sense. It's not logical. And so we've seen across the state people that have had and engaged in massive exodus. They've left law enforcement, people with a lot of experience with, whose hearts were into the vocation and the calling of being a police officer. So we've lost thousands of years of law enforcement experience. And now we're getting these young folks that are coming in, although perhaps with a good intent and a good heart, but basically with no one to mentor them. And so, when the 911 calls are coming in, law enforcement is having to either, extend the hours of the officers that are already assigned to a shift, or seeking civilians to help them out in some of the non-priority calls. And I'm afraid that we're going to see a lot more of that, and that is correlated with crime inevitably. We're going to, crime is only going to go up, and the economy is going to slow down and continue to do so. The post-pandemic psychological effects are just beginning to be felt. And then you add to that the shortage of law enforcement is kind of like the perfect storm.
What is the trait, as someone who trains law enforcement officials, what is the trait you most like to see in a recruit or someone who's studying law enforcement?
Character. That's an easy one, character. I think that, and I define character as doing the right thing when no one else is looking, right? So I will tell you that, what worries me, and I wouldn't say what keeps me up at night, but one of the things that does worry me a lot about law enforcement is that in the next 10, 20 years, some of us have been attempting with every sweat, blood, and tears that we've had, in my case for 25 years, to make the profession better. I believe we've added that little grain of salt to that process. But I will tell you that what worries me for the next 10, 20 years is the fact that we're getting people that are seeking a profession, not seeking a vocation. And law enforcement is about vocation, is about an individual that decides at the age of 21, 22 years of age, and sometimes older than that, but they decide that they're going to put their lives on the line to save a person that has no voice and that has no vote in the matter. And it is, there's no money, there's no retirement package, there's no insurance package that you can give somebody to risk their lives, for the betterment of society. And so it is a vocation. It is something that you're called to do, not something that you evolve to doing because somehow you want to carry a gun and have a badge and impress your friends. And I'm hoping that character that leads somebody to have that vocation is what prevails in the next 10, 20 years. But we have yet to see that.
Dr. Del Carmen, we ask police officers, law enforcement officials to do so much in the world to prevent crime, to deal with criminals, to deal with mental health issues. How, as citizens, can we help our law enforcement community do their job and battle crime?
Well, for starters, I think we need to do a better job of trying to understand what police officers actually do. There's such a large misconception about the job that cops have, the very difficult job that they have on a daily basis. And, a lot of people in our society walk around forming opinions about police officers from what they watch on TV, either through some sort of a Hollywood-based movie or perhaps even a series that they watch on Netflix. And they think that, I know all about law enforcement now because of that. Or they catch the 5 o'clock news or the national news and they see a police officer doing things that are unethical and illegal, and then they cast the net and say everybody's that way, which obviously is not. So I think the first thing to do is we need to participate in their lives. And how do we do that? Volunteer for a ride-along. Come over to your local police department and volunteer to do a ride-along, to be with a police officer for an 8-hour shift and actually begin to understand what it's like to be a cop, right? To have what I call 100 hours of boredom and 1 second of terror. In other words, you're out there writing, citations or writing massive reports on an accident, trying to save somebody's life. And then 5 seconds later, you're running, chasing a person that just left 3 bodies in his home and is running down the street, and you're pursuing that person. So, that's the first thing. The second thing is to support them, right? To support them and to give them the necessary tools, to demand from our city councils to give them the appropriate dollars that they need in order to buy the equipment, to get the mental health treatment that officers need. We have a lot of police officers now dealing with PTSD, with various traumas and things that they see. Look, I'm not a cop, and in my 25 years, I've seen, fatalities. I've seen people that die in the streets as a result of a gunshot wound in the line of work that I do as a criminologist, and I experience those nightmares. I experience those images from time to time. I cannot imagine what it's like for these folks that do it on a daily basis, and having to one day just turn off the key of their car and call on the radio for their last call and then retire and be expected to be quote unquote functioning beings in our society after they've seen all that they've seen. We just do a really poor job of requiring those sorts of benefits and help to the law enforcement profession. One of the highest divorce rates we can see among cops, highest divorce rates, highest alcoholism rate, highest suicide rate in most of the professions out there, but yet we're not helping them because we don't understand them, but yet we require of them a great deal, all the way from services like my cat climbed on the tree and I need to get my cat down to, my husband's beating me up. I need somebody to show up and help.
I want to thank my guest today, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, who heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. Dr. Del Carmen, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.